For millennia, settled states have had to deal with the nomad problem. See, if you're a settled state and you're located right next to the steppes, right next to, these vast grasslands that are home to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or more pastoral peoples. These are armed people, these are mobile people, these are people who tend to be militaristically organized. You're likely to view them as a threat. These are people who routinely raid, or seem to routinely raid, your towns and cities, thus, damaging your bottom line tax-wise. These are people who cannot be conquered, or they're very, very difficult to conquer. Thus, they cannot be taxed. And they consistently, threaten your monopoly over the possession of armies in the area. You're the one that's supposed to have an army. In fact, your whole justification for taxing your people is that you provide security, and they're constantly challenging that. No wonder the settled states abhorred the nomads, writing about them and their histories in the most withering terms, referring to them as barbarians or its equivalent. For thousands of years, the nomads were the great problem of the landed empires that just wouldn't go away until modern technology came along. And the first modern empire that should probably be credited with the real pacification of nomadism is the Russian Empire. But before modern Russia came along, Russia had its problems with nomads just like every other agriculturalist society. For millennia, the Russians, or their ancestors, had to deal with the nomads. The early Slavic peoples, many of them lived in the forests right on the edge of the steppe. So there's been this millennia-old tug of war between nomadic peoples, or semi-nomadic peoples, and these early Slavic peoples. And when Russian history began, let's say when the establishment of Kievan Rus, the great nemesis of Kievan Rus was the Kazakh Khaganate. For a century, these two duked it out until finally the Russians were able to take the Khaganate down in the 960s. Compare that to other major states in China and India and the Middle East and Central Asia who are being taken down or dominated by nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples during this same period. And for a couple centuries, Kievan Rus was able to live in relative peace with its nomadic and semi-nomadic neighbors. Kievan Rus very politically fragmented at this point. Then in the 1200s, though, for the first and only time in Russian history, nomads would burst out of the east and take down, completely conquer Russia. Of course, we're talking here about the Mongols, who left a trail of ruined cities and towns and human bodies in their wake. It was a very, very bloody conquest, and when they were done, the point of every empire, agriculturalist or nomadic, is systematized plunder. So, of course, when they were done, they established over the Russian people Mongol overlords who expected their taxes to be paid. Well, after the breakup of the Mongol Empire, of course, the Russians found themselves under the yoke of the Golden Horde branch of the Mongols. Well, eventually the Golden Horde was overthrown, and into the present, the Russians remember the Mongol era of their history as a dark age, an age when their ancestors were under the Tatar yoke. Now, the group to benefit from the fall of the Golden Horde the most was not Kiev. There would be no rising of Kiev from the Mongols' ashes. No, it was Moscow, it was Muscovy, the Muscovite princes. These are people who had often enthusiastically supported and collaborated with, as their tax collectors, the Golden Horde. They're the ones who eventually boot the Mongols out now that they're on top. And over the years, they're able to tighten their grip over the people of Russia and the people's wealth, often trumpeting their legitimacy as having succeeded the Golden Horde. Okay, so this is Moscow. Moscow, still the center of Russian power, originally gaining that power thanks to a nomadic people from the steppes, from the east. In any case, this was a time, as the years went by, when identities are rigidifying. See, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Many refugees from Byzantium had flowed into Moscow, flowed into Russia. A Byzantine princess had married into the Muscovite royal family, and Russia had become the last great bastion of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So all this comes together to create a very specific identity if you want to be a Russian. Russians are settled, Russians are Christian, Russians are Eastern Orthodox Christian. That's a Russian. And if you're not those things, you're not a Russian. So for example, if you're one of the steppe peoples, you're likely nomadic, you're not settled. You're likely pagan or later Mohammedan, you're Muslim. See, the Islamization of many of the steppe peoples helped further rigidify identities. So if you're a nomadic Muslim Turk, you're definitely not a Russian. So that separation, this pre-existing opposition, is made even more rigid. Over time too, the Russian elite, we're talking about the intelligentsia and the cultural elite, as well as the upper classes, began to identify more and more with Europe and Europeans and European culture. They're adopting things like modern science and at least partial secularism. And as a result, it is inculcated among them the idea that the nomads and pastoralist peoples, these are backward peoples, uncivilized, barbarians. It doesn't help that many Europeans don't consider the Russians European, no matter what the Russians do. Think of Napoleon and his famous line, "Scratch a Russian and a Tatar pops out." And we've all seen this before. The spurned are that much more motivated to prove themselves because they're spurned. And this is a phenomenon we see with this Russian upper class, so motivated to be European. So that distance between them and the nomads and the pastoralist peoples, the others, is widened that much more. In fact, it's during this time that the idea is promulgated that Russia's own backwardness vis-a-vis other European countries is the very fault of the nomads. It's the fault of the Mongol Dark Age. That was a 60-hour train ride. In any case, the Tsars recruited from among the nomads. They recruited them as mercenaries. And from about the reign of Peter the Great on into the 20th century, so we're talking about from about 1700 into the 20th century, Russia made steady gains against nomadic peoples, expanding very, very quickly, in large part because Russia had adopted Western European military technology. This is technology that really, for the first time in history, allowed the modern state to really subdue these pastoralist peoples. By the mid-1800s, the Kazakhs had been subdued. By the late 1880s, the Turkmen had been subdued. And the goal, of course, was to turn these nomadic people into submissive, loyal, tax-paying, settled people. And if that meant scrubbing them of Islam, as was attempted among the Kazakhs, whose Islam was considered by the Russians to be not as deep-rooted, well then so be it. The real kicker, though, wasn't necessarily the Russian guns, big Russian guns, although those helped, but wave after wave of Russian colonists. This'll do it. From the 1890s on in particular, Russians were motivated through a series of incentives to tame the steppes, go and farm the steppes. And they answered the call by the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. In fact, over a couple decades, something like 5 million Slavic farmers came and set up shop on the steppes. They really did tame the steppes. Meanwhile, the Russification of the nomad elite was accomplished mostly through the state education system. Basically, they were educated out of their children were educated out of their lifestyle. And if you failed to adapt, you starved. All your steppe land, all that land for your herds is gone. Or at least it's shrinking and disappearing. Many survived by becoming laborers, paid laborers on Russian farms. So these Russian colonists come in, take the land, and then the nomads who have nowhere to roam become paid workers on the Russian farms. In other words, they're working land that they and their herds once roamed freely. A wave of Central Asian revolutions against the Russian state end badly in 1916. It doesn't really matter, because of course the next year is the Russian Revolution, and the Bolsheviks come to power. And incredibly, the nomads are going to do far worse under the Bolsheviks than they did before. See, the Bolsheviks claim that science has settled the question of whether or not nomadic life is inferior. It clearly is. And besides, these guys need to be settled if they're going to enjoy the benefits of communist medicine and schooling. So Soviet collectivization becomes the next great enemy of the nomadic way of life. And one could argue the worst enemy it had ever faced. Once Stalin was in control, collectivization was stepped up against the nomads in a very brutal way. In fact, in just 4 years, 1928 to to 1932, something like 80% of all of the nomads' animals was slaughtered. 80% of these animals are slaughtered. Of course, the point is to get the nomads to settle down, to become farmers. But they've got nothing to replace the nomadic economy with. They don't know how to farm. They don't have farming provisions. And so what do you think's going to happen? It's the same thing that had happened elsewhere in the Soviet Union. That is death by starvation on a massive scale. 1.5 million Kazakhs died of starvation or disease connected to starvation in the 1930s. 1.5 million Kazakhs. That's a third of the entire Kazakh population. Tens of thousands more were straight up executed by the regime. This is a regime, by the way, that has airplanes, that has machine guns. But for millennia, nomads had always been able to mount a rapid retreat, a rapid attack or a rapid retreat. But the old tactics, they're useless against the modern state. And by the time the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, most Central Asian nomadic people had lost the bulk, virtually all, of their nomadic heritage. In many cases, including their own language. They'd been Russified to a very, very large degree. Now, it's true, small patches of nomadism still exist, but for all intents and purposes, the sedentary state in the form of Muscovy, well, you could count Kiev, and then Muscovy, and the Russian Empire, and then the USSR, had won. Russia killed nomadism as a major living, breathing Central Asian tradition.